Yeah,
So, welcome back. As you can see, we have Jerry Mazinsky today, and we are going to talk about a new approach about mental health. So, um, yeah, Jerry, Mace is a method. If memory serves, somebody in Australia stumbled on it.
yeah, John Mace.
Yeah, okay. So, what do we know about John Mace?
Well, John Mace spent close to 50 years trying to figure out how the mind worked.
Hmm.
He wasn't a psychologist. He wasn't a psychiatrist. The you know the majority of his time he was a master mariner. So what he did is he was a captain of these giant freighters that moved back and forth across the ocean. And even during that time, he was trying to figure out how the mind worked. So it was similar to what I was doing, is trying to figure out how the mind worked, you know, going through 4 years of psychology, 2 years of counseling, another 2 years in a PhD program, hundreds of hours of in-service training, which got me virtually nowhere. Okay, I just lost your picture. Are you still there?
Yeah, wait a bit.
Okay, you're back. Okay. So John was the same way. He was trying to figure out how the mind worked. And in those long voyages across the ocean, he would read all kinds of books that would give him some idea, all the way going back to ancient Greece, as far as how the mind worked. And he spent 50 years trying to put this together. Finally, now he had a background with dealing with different kinds of energy. Okay, so running a big ship, you have to deal with all kinds of energy. Gravity, magnetism, induction, electricity, virtually every kind of energy there is has to be managed on those big ships. So he had to be a master of that, and he was a master mariner. He was also a harbor um, captain, so he would steer these big ships into the harbor. So he had a good background in energy and how it flowed. He saw that energy flowed from negative to positive generically. Okay. And he's trying to put this together as far as humans go. Now, he had a peak experience once where he was out of his body for a period of time. And he realized that the spirit was energy. It was confined in the body, but it was energy in and of itself. Okay. So he was aware, he was outside his body. He was aware, and that kind of turned everything around for him. And as far as his thinking and how energy operated. And it was the first time he'd been out of his body. Yeah. So uh, he realized even before that was that people create something called positive and negative identities. Okay. So a positive identity is, like you had a positive identity as a hostess on airlines. You now have a positive identity as a podcaster. You know, Mace had a positive identity as a ship's captain. Okay. So positive identities help you survive. They're created. So you also have a positive identity probably as a car driver and any other thing you do that helps you survive on the planet. Everything that you do has to be done through an identity. So I have an identity as a pilot. I have an identity as a scuba diver. I have an identity as a motorcycle rider. Uh, these are all separate identities that I use to do different things. Everybody has positive identities to help them survive on this planet. But there's also something called a negative identity that Mace found decades ago, but he didn't know how to get rid of it. Okay. So a negative identity generates negative feelings. Okay. And the person is not aware of it because it is created during a trauma. And he defines trauma as anything you experience that you don't want to experience. It's not your choice. Okay. He found that negative identities generate negative feelings. Okay. So negative identities are created during a trauma, as well as the negative feelings that go along with them. Okay. And he found that if people can create negative identities, they can also discreate them. And that was the conclusion of his research probably 50 years later. And he also found that our feelings dictate our lives. They dictate what you do, how you operate, how you see the world. And negative feelings are the basis of negative identities. So negative identities generate negative feelings. So negative identities are composed of negative energy. Okay? And he also found that like Einstein said, in order to overcome the problem, we need to completely have a different type of consciousness than the system that caused the problem in the first place. Okay? So he's saying you need to operate outside of that system. Okay? So with me, I was operating outside of the system and discovered that these spiritual voices are what causes schizophrenia. Um, and I have some people I can bring on with you that have actually seen these things. You know?
Mm.
um, so I was outside the regular system because the regular system was saying these things are auditory hallucinations. They're not real. Even though they have no proof of that, they've done no research into it at all. But like I said, they're making $11 billion a year selling antipsychotic drugs to tranquilize these people who are hearing voices. And those drugs cure absolutely nothing.
Mm.
Right? So I had to
I have
operate.
one question.
Okay.
Um, these negative identities. I mean, okay, some people get raped, they experience a bad robbery, or they get tortured, but not everybody
Mhm.
experiences those things. So for, let's say, somebody that didn't have these extreme experiences, what would constitute a negative identity?
Well, this is a very hard planet to live on. I
Hmm.
only know maybe one or two people who have not suffered some kind of trauma at the hands of schoolmates, mother, father, brothers, sisters, supposed friends, the system, you know. And it doesn't have to be a trauma of the magnitude of what you were talking about. Doesn't have to be that big, you know. But virtually everybody suffers some kind of trauma.
Hmm.
And it just what happens in a trauma is there's a very bad feeling, you know, and it's generated during the trauma, and then it just kind of stays there and torments you for a long time. It's like it feels forever. And at the same time that that trauma is happening, you made a decision, and people aren't aware of that. You made a decision as to who you are or what you are as a result of that trauma. Okay, so that trauma affects there's a decision made as to your relationship with that trauma. Okay, so when that trauma stays there long enough and torments you long enough, the ego shows up and says, okay, you're not doing good with this. Let me handle this. And what it does is it takes that trauma and that decision and it throws it up into your subconscious mind and then it locks it down. At that point, it becomes a negative identity. And there's also an energy ridge there. That thing wants to get out, and the ego doesn't want to let it out because it causes bad feelings and it causes upsets. And the person has not been able to solve that on their own. So the ego locks it down, but it's not dead. It's still there, it's still alive, and it's still affecting you. Okay. But there's also an energy ridge there also because it takes a constant supply of energy to keep that thing locked up and out of your conscious mind and out of your face. So there's an energy ridge there. It's pushing to get out. The ego is pushing to keep it in. That's a constant drain on the limited amount of energy you have. So these people that have several negative identities, they're drained all the time. They just don't know where their energy is going. It's going to keep that stuff locked up in there. Yeah.
In other words, they constantly feel exhausted.
Yes. But they don't know why.
Mhm.
Because that once it's locked up in your subconscious, it's no longer available to you. Now the way it does show itself, it sits there, it's like an explosive almost. It sits there like a landmine, waiting for somebody like the person who caused the trauma in the first place to trigger enough characteristics of that person that started the trauma in the first place to set it off. Okay. So if the person is close to the person who caused the trauma in the first place, that thing starts oscillating. And when that person becomes close enough to that person who caused the trauma and shows his cards, and the person decides, or the ego decides, that's too close. I don't want anybody like that near me. That thing goes off, and it tells the person either attack that person or run from that person or avoid that person. Okay. So because it's that negative identity is up there, it's like a beacon light for those kind of people. So as each one of those kind of people show up, it causes a mental storm, a mental disturbance. Okay. And the person, if he's not going to attack that other person, he sits there and kind of bites his teeth and is anxious and angry and trying to suppress that. And here's the ego telling him, it's not you, it's that person out there. You can see that person out there. You don't like him. He's right there. Anybody who's like them, you never liked. You know. So every time somebody like that shows up in that person's psychological sphere, this thing goes off. And the more it goes off, the more the person believes, well, that's just who I am. I just don't like these people. That's just who I am. But it's not. This is like a murky covering over the spirit. It's like an explosive sitting there waiting to go off. But it also uh, interferes with your normal functioning still because it bleeds into the conscious mind by projection. So like a computer virus, you don't see the virus. What you see is the effect it has on the computer.
Mm.
So the person with a strong negative identity can't see that negative identity, but they can see the results of the projections out onto the world. Like, get away from that person, that bad person. Stay away from these kind of people. And these people usually have several encounters with those kind of people. And each time that negative identity goes off, it further reinforces that that is something that belongs to the person. Because they go, well, this keeps happening. It just must be me. All right? But it's not. Okay. So it affects what the person does, what they don't do, what they say, what they don't say, uh, what they think, their attitude toward life. It colors all of that. Okay. It's like I said, the negative feelings associated with that negative identity dictate your life. Yeah. So if you're feeling bad, your life feels bad. Okay. But Mace found that people create their own feelings through these negative identities. So he knew that years ago, but he didn't know how to discreate them. He only found that just before the end of his life. Okay. So he said negative feelings are the basis of your identities, you know, and they dictate your life. So he said also in order to overcome them, that problem, you have to come in from a completely different consciousness than the one that started that problem. Okay? That Einstein said the same thing. Okay? So, Mace went from being a ship captain when he retired to getting a master's in counseling, and he didn't find that useful either, just like I didn't. Once you get onto the front lines and you start using that, it doesn't work very well, if at all, and it doesn't work at all with schizophrenics or more severely dis people. So he came to the conclusion that if you create your feelings, you must be able to discreate them. Okay. And also, the negative feelings you create are non survival. And the law of survival is you won't create something that you're aware will interfere with your survival. So these negative identities are created subconsciously. They're not created on purpose. Okay? And another neat trait of the Mace method is the therapist doesn't need to know what that negative um, trauma was that created that negative identity. So if the person was sexually molested or it was something embarrassing that they didn't want to talk about, or rape or something like that, the therapist doesn't have to know what that situation was.
Mm.
And I've dealt with a number of people where at the end of the session they felt immensely better, but I had no idea what actually happened to them. You know, it's not necessary because we're dealing with energy, positive and negative energy. So the mission statement of Mace was to assist people in getting control of their lives and living their lives in their dreams without these negative identities because they're constantly interfering with what you want to do. They're like a log that you keep um, tripping over. You know.
Mm-hmm. Um, so in other words, when you do a maze session, you will not be re-traumatized because you have to talk about it.
Well, you will have to, for a brief period of time, think about it, but
Mm.
the therapist doesn't have to know what you're thinking about. Okay,
Okay.
so you'll have to bring it up and the feelings associated with it are the negative energy that we need to go after. So if somebody said, "Well, okay, I got a trauma," okay, all the therapist needs to know is where it happened and how the person felt about it. That's it. They don't need to know any of the details. Who did it? What happened? When it happened? Any of that stuff. So the person will be thinking about it on their own for a brief period of time until they get the feeling. Okay. But it's not like, oh, here, tell me about what exactly happened and what you did and all that which re-traumatizes the person every time. Okay. So this method flies in the face of what psychiatry and psychology have been teaching for decades. This is an energetic psychotherapy. It's so far ahead, it's light years ahead of what they're teaching in the universities now. So the Mace Institute went to one of the big Australian universities and said, "Hey, listen, this works. We'll show it to you. We'll demonstrate that it works." And said, "You should be teaching this instead of the garbage you're teaching." And they said, "Oh, well, we'll consider it if you give us the patent." And the Mace people said, "Adios, amigos. You're not getting the patent. Keep teaching the junk you're teaching." So they went to the legislature in Australia, and they showed them how well it worked, and they said this should be used in your mental health centers, you know, and they just kind of blew it off, you know. So there's a lot of powerful um, entities, organizations that don't want this out because it works. It's called Causism because it gets to the cause of the problem and helps the person or causes the person to discreate it. So it actually discreates these negative identities that the person created by accident. So one other problem Mace had was finding those negative identities. You know, how did you find them? Okay. So Mace also found that the mind doesn't operate like the universities are teaching. It doesn't think, it doesn't rationalize, it doesn't organize things. He said the mind has only one function, and that's to create a mental picture of whatever your attention is on. Okay, so that's easily demonstratable. If I say to you the word apple, what do you see?
Yeah, not an elephant.
Not an elephant. Okay, you see an apple?
Yeah, sure.
What color is it?
Mine is green.
There you go. Okay, if I say automobile, what do you
Hmm.
see?
A car,
What color is it?
black.
Okay. So here's your mind creating the pictures from a word.
Hmm.
You know, so it's evidence that the mind focuses on whatever it's focused on. The mind creates pictures of it. Okay. And you talk to some of these people that use LSD and they'll say, well, I swung my hand in front of my face and it was like boom, 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 boom,
Hmm.
boom. So here's these pictures being created slowly instead of smoothly. Okay. So Mace found that you can create pictures not just when you focus on physical objects, the mind can create pictures of concepts. Okay.
Sure.
And he discovered that once you can make a picture out of a concept, then you can get rid of that negative identity associated with it. Okay. And that was one of the last things he found. Okay. So the mind has no ability to rationalize or remember or think. Well, May says it just creates pictures of wherever you put your attention. Okay. The spirit does the thinking, or he called it the being. It's the being that does the rationalizing. It's the being that does the thinking. And he found that out when he went out of body. So he had no body. You know, he had no brain. You know, all he had was his spirit. Okay? And he thought that he could still see things in the spirit, but there wasn't any feeling involved. Okay?
Have you ever encountered anybody who didn't know that they were traumatized and refused to accept it?
There are some that had it so far buried that it
Okay.
was hard for them to dig out. You know, um, but usually when they find out they don't have to talk about it, you can tell them, okay, this is a hard planet to live on. Nobody gets away without being traumatized in some way, shape, or form. We're going to be looking for a trauma, and we want the first one that shows up. You don't have to tell me what it is. Go look and see if you can find it. Virtually everybody is able to find a trauma that way. Okay. And then once they have it, it's like, okay, hang on to it. You know, where were you at the time that that happened? Okay. And they will say, and then you want to kind of make it real for them. Like, what did you see around you at that
So
time?
you mean like in your house, in the cellar, oh,
Yep.
okay.
In the house, in the cellar, uh, in the park, outside, inside. And then the second one is, you know, were you standing, sitting, lying down?
Mhm.
Right? The three positions that you could possibly be in, unless you're stooping. Okay. So you allow them to recreate that trauma in their mind, even though you don't know what it is. Okay. They're much less threatened with that. You know? So that hasn't been as big a problem in most cases. There are some people who cannot form an image from a thought. That's very rare, but it does happen. Okay? If they can't form an image, then you can work with the feeling. If they can't, if they can't generate that feeling, Mace doesn't work. Okay? So they may not be able to form an image of the trauma, but if they can generate the feeling back again, you might be able to do something with it, but they're still going to have to turn that feeling into an image. That's where the problem would be. If they can't turn that feeling into an image, this doesn't work. or not doesn't work well. Okay. So like anger is a concept. You can close your eyes and form a picture of what that looks like. Yeah. So once you turn the feeling into a concept, then you can get rid of it. Okay. So feelings control your life. It's generally accepted that a person consists of three elements: body, mind, and spirit. Mace found a fourth one, the negative identity, that hasn't been addressed. And it took him years to figure that out. Okay. So, so it's the negative identity is clusters of negative energy. Okay. So they may result from different types of trauma. Okay. So a person may be traumatized in several different ways. But what's interesting about this is once you hit a main trauma, a one that causes that landmine to go off over and over and over again. Once you get rid of that trauma, all the others, like dominoes, will fall behind it. So any trauma associated with that main trauma that has been triggered will also go down the whole line.
Mhm.
Okay, with that particular trauma. Now there may be other types of trauma that weren't similar to that one, which need to be dealt with individually. Okay? And then there's a different form of mace to use with relationships that kind of get rid of the trauma involved with relationships. Okay? So those are the two big main types of trauma. Okay?
And when you say relationships, it can be all kinds of things like parents and children, lovers and
Churches,
friends. Mm,
I've had people come out from the Mormon church who were traumatized by the church.
okay.
People who've been traumatized by the Catholic Church. There was one lady, she was a mess because it taught you are a sinner, you will be punished, you will burn in hell. And she
Yeah.
believed that. And she's like, how many things did I do where I sinned and I'm going to burn in hell? And she was just a mess because of that. So your life revolves around these identities. And these identities are where feelings come from. So, you know, the positive ones help us survive. Okay. And they're created unconsciously, like I said.
Yeah.
So, um,
Yeah, I
like,
mean, this health thing is a very destructive teaching.
yeah,
And combined with this, yeah, you are a sinner anyhow, because two people decided thousands of years ago to eat a particular fruit that they shouldn't have. Um, and because you are a descendant of those nasty people, you can only hope for the grace of God. So, and what I find very problematic with that approach is that you get beaten down right from the get-go.
right. Even
And
before you're born as a sinner.
yeah, exactly. Plus, um, you know, let's say in the real world, a mother is angry with her child and she puts that child on a hot stove. She will go to prison, and rightfully so. But if I imagine my God to do the same, then my goodness, we have a huge problem because you know what I mean?
Oh, I know the whole Old Testament is full of that. You need to be punished. You need to be killed. The Israelites would go in and they would wipe out entire cities, women, children, and men. The
Yeah,
entire city. They sacrificed who knows how many tens of thousands of animals. Sacrificed, and it's a mean, angry God that know, they worshipped. Uh, and what kind of God is that? And it's all through the Old Testament. You will burn if you don't do these things. If you don't do what the preacher said, if you don't do what the prophets say, you will burn in hell forever.
Yeah.
The New
And
Testament is a lot different.
that is the discrepancy. On the one hand, you are supposed to love and trust God unconditionally, and on the other hand, you are being taught that you are not deserving God's mercy anyhow, and yada yada yada. So that is a confusion game.
Hmm. Yep,
Yeah.
they're diametrically opposed as far as I'm concerned. Then you look into what the Gnostics are talking about. They're saying the God of the Old Testament is something called the demiurge.
Hmm.
Okay, it's like an offshoot of the real God that the New Testament's talking about, and it created this world and owns this world, and it's constantly, if you know what, you know, these the thoughts that schizophrenics get are consistently negative, abusive, nasty thoughts. Okay, it's nothing good. They come from these voices. You know, um, it's always you're no good, you're rotten, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're rotten. Nobody likes you. Everybody's plotting behind your back. I mean, every rotten thing you can think of. These things are injecting into the person's thought stream. Now, this is different from a negative identity. Okay, so this is a
But can it
negative
lead
entity.
to a negative identity?
The negative identity is usually there first,
Ah, okay.
so it's generating the negative energy
Mhm.
already. Okay, and the more negative identities there are, the more chance there are that these things are going to come and start feeding off of that person, because they're like sharks in the ocean. These spirits wander around, and if they see somebody generating negative energy, they go in for the feast. So it's like a shark with a wounded animal in the water. They smell the blood and they go in for the killing. Okay? So these are two different things. Now, now I know that the head instructor for Mace said, "Oh, it's all negative identities," and I said, "The hell it is." I said, "I've got a lot of experience with schizophrenics, and these voices are not negative identities. These are
Are
negative
they a
entities.
result of the negative identity?
They, there's a gray area there, between the two. And sometimes what I think is a negative entity, when it's treated as a negative identity, will disappear. But negative entities, when treated as a negative identity, will not disappear. They will get more obstinate. They will tell the person, "Don't listen to this guy. He's a nutcase." You know, um, we're still here. We're not going anywhere. Kind of thing. But what's interesting is in two cases now, once with myself, once with another Mace practitioner, once we drained down the negative identities, the voices started begging for energy.
Ah, yeah.
They weren't gone, but they were significantly weakened because that negative energy that they were feeding on, that they were triggering, wasn't there anymore. So they had to generate negative energy somewhere else. And one big thing that's really tragic with psychiatry is the lie that they have put out that these voices, that these are auditory hallucinations, that they're not real.
Mm,
They have no evidence for that. They have no proof of that. They haven't done any research into it. And if any of them tried, the rest of them would start mocking them, saying, "You're a nutcase. These got to be, you know, hallucinations because that's what they look like." All
mm,
right. The problem is what I found through years of research is that they run specific repeatable patterns, and negative, hallucinations don't do that. Hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negatives, they're everywhere in between. They don't run patterns. These negative entities run specific, repeatable patterns. What they say is consistently negative. It's always negative. So what holds them on a negative trajectory? Why aren't they random? Why aren't they random like regular hallucinations? They're not. Psychiatry has no explanation for that. You know, they're making $11 billion a year, billion, not million, billion, selling these toxic, brain destroying antipsychotic medications that cure absolutely nothing. All they are is major tranquilizers that treat symptoms. Okay? They don't cure anything. You ask any psychiatrist, have you ever cured a mental illness? If he's telling the truth, he'll say no. They don't cure anything. They just treat symptoms. All right.
But
So
isn't
Mace,
that in general a problem with our medicine these days, that it is more anchored in, it's very materialistic instead of holistic,
yes,
and thinking that, yeah, okay, the human body is like a car, and if something is not functioning, then you cut this out, and or you replace this with an artificial type of, let's say, joint or whatever. I'm not saying that it cannot give relief in certain circumstances, but a human is not a car,
right.
and you cannot just focus on this particular point in the body and ignore all the rest, like circumstances of the person's life. What you just said, trauma, a lot of what is expressed as a physical illness might very well have psychological roots.
Well, it kind of does. I mean, I do a sweep of the person, every single person I work with, and there was one lady who was alcoholic that after we were done with her, she was able to drink normally for a long, as long as I was in contact with her. There's another Mace practitioner that says she worked with a person who was arthritic, and when she was done, that person recovered, and the lab tests for arthritis, I don't know what they were normal. Okay. Um, there's people I worked with that had physical problems that were significantly lessened because there's usually a psychosomatic aspect to every physical problem. Okay. Once that's gone, the healing occurs quicker. Okay. And medicine has its place. You look at they've found cures for um, what uh, typhoid fever, malaria, all these things. They found cures in the last 100 years. Medicine proper has found cures for them. You look in the last 100 years, what has psychiatry or psychology found any cure for?
Nothing.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
It's more like they are administrating the demise.
Yeah, or treating symptoms.
Hmm.
Yeah. So this system that Mace came up with is called Causism because it gets to the cause of the illness, the psychological problem. So once they identify the person has that idea of what happened and how they felt about it, then you get uh, that feeling and turn it into a picture. Okay. And that picture will represent those feelings. Okay. And then you take that picture and you fill it with those feelings until it expands. All right. Now, Mace found that negative energy travels toward positive energy. Okay? So once the person fills that picture with all these traumas, and there's there's tons of feelings. I mean, you know, fear, anger, sad, frustration, abuse, distrust, confusion, resentment. It just goes on and on. You know, you fill that picture with all these things and it will grow. Okay. And he found that negative energy will move toward positive energy. And in this case, a bridge is built between that negative energy, like a pipeline, to the person's spirit, which is positive energy. And the spirit will absorb this negative energy and turn it into positive potential. Okay? It doesn't get rid of it, it changes it. And once that negative identity is drained, it no longer exists as any kind of power. So it's like the process is similar to getting a car battery. You can get a brand new car battery, drain all the energy out of it totally. And then, even though it's brand new, it won't take a charge again. It's dead. It's a boat anchor. You can't use it anymore. That's why they say you got to keep your batteries charged up. You can't let them go completely dead. Well, with the negative identity, once that's completely discharged or discreated, it's dead. It's not there anymore. The person will remember the trauma, but there won't be any emotional charge to it. You know, because at the end of the session, you prove that to them. You go, okay, go back to this trauma, and how do you feel about it now? And they'll say, I see it, but it doesn't affect me. It doesn't bother me. You know, so that negative identity is gone. You know, so because you're affected by what you don't know about. Okay, the Mace process awakens the person to that negative identity. You know, just like with the schizophrenic, once they realize that those voices are not them, they don't come from them, they're separate from who they are, then they have something to fight back against. You know, before, you can't fight back against your own mind. You know, and that's what they were feeling. You know, everybody thinks that whatever thought comes into your mind belongs to you. That's far from the truth. These negative entities, they get everybody. You know, they're inserting negative thoughts into their minds all the time. And if you listen to it, they got you hooked. So they're like fishermen that bait the hook and they throw out this negative thought based on your negative identities. You know, they and if you bite on it, then they reel you in. Okay. And what's so sneaky is those thoughts, for the most part, sound just like the thousands of other thoughts that go through your mind on an average day. You know, there's no like, we are the voices, we're putting this thought in your head. No, this negative thought just appears in your mind, you know. And if you aren't aware that it doesn't belong to you, that's what they're hoping for, you know. And I've had scores of patients that would ask these things, who are you? What are you? And they would tell them, we are you.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
We are you, plural. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I mean, we already talked about in other interviews about drugs, alcohol, how that can be a portal. Is it also possible that people who have been extremely traumatized are very vulnerable to these attacks?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they're generating negative energy.
Mm.
You know, the more negative energy they generate, the more these things are liable, because they're looking for a food source. You know, and when they spot a pool of negative energy, they move on in there. You know, so paranoid people are generally always producing negative energy. You know, these people are watching me, they're following me, they're after me. Um, you know, they're tricking me, they're around somewhere, they're taking my stuff from me. It's consistent production of negative emotional energy.
This was the public hour. For full access of the entire interview, please join our Patreon community. Thank you.